All right, so to pick back up, to finish here, our last slide, if I'd noticed that there was only one slide, I would have just powered through that last slide and we would have taken a break after this, but I didn't notice until after we'd already stopped. How Jesus fits into the story with regard to the covenants, we've got the image here from our Bible Project video, right? Noah, Abraham, Moses, and then David. And so how Jesus fits into that is Jesus is connected to each of those stories, right? Just like Isaac, Abraham goes to sacrifice Isaac. Jesus is the sacrificed first born son. Just like Moses, the great deliverer, leading the people into the promised land. There's even some really interesting connections there. I'll show you in the next PowerPoint. Just like Joshua, he conquers the enemies of God's people. Just like David, he's the righteous king. Just like Jeremiah, he's the prophet that weeps for the people. Just like Daniel, remains faithful in the face of persecution. And so, like I've said, throughout this lecture and the one previous, all of these things, I mean, they're all pointing us to Jesus. All the covenants are pointing us to Jesus. All of the books are pointing to Jesus. That is, this one consistent story of the Bible is all pointing in the direction of Jesus. And on the first day, we talked about that one passage in Galatians chapter 3, when Paul says the law is the tutor that leads us to Christ, right? That's the idea, is that the entire Old Testament is this servant that is leading us to Jesus, right? And so that's how we should interpret the Old Testament, is pointing us to Jesus.
I have one question.
Yeah?
I need to write it down now.
Okay.
What did you say about the other thing other than I am? It was good. I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, it was the I am was Yahweh and the His was.
Yeah. Yeah, so the way that you can think of it is, when God says in Exodus 3, it's Exodus 3:14, that's where he says, I am that I am. And then a little bit later in that same chapter, we get him referring to himself as the Lord. And remember, Lord in all caps is Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
So this word in Hebrew is related to this word in Hebrew. This word in Hebrew is Ehyeh. This word in Hebrew is Yahweh.
See?
So you can see connection between those squiggles, right? And then this squiggle, it's called a yod, and this one vav. These are somewhat related. You'll just have to take my word on that one. This, if you know, like Spanish or any other language, verbs tend to conjugate. And so when we say, like, I do something versus you do something versus he does something, this is how Hebrew does that. So this part indicates I, this part indicates he. So when God says I am, that's how he refers to himself.
Yeah.
We refer to him as he is. Right? So he says I am, we say he is. He says I will be, we say he will be. Right? Yeah. So that's how that works. But that's a good question. And this is, I think the Bible Project even has a video on the divine name that unpacks this a little bit. That is, it's pretty good. So, Act 3 still, we're still doing Act 3, yeah.
How hard is it to learn that?
Hebrew. It's, the best way to describe it is Greek starts easier and gets harder. Hebrew starts harder and gets easier. Hebrew is very, very different, but it's actually a much simpler language. So there aren't a lot of like really bizarre things in the language that are really hard to get used to. You'll learn this when you have kids and you have to try to teach them how to read, and you're like, that's the sound that this letter makes, except for when it's beside this letter, or beside this letter, or beside this letter, or beside this letter, right? And so like the easiest example of that is, how do you pronounce GH, right? Well, it depends on if it's this or this,
What
Right.
other O did you write?
TOU. So it could be
Yeah.
F, or it could be G, or it could be
So,
silent, right? And so those two letters in English, like, good luck, right? There's nothing like that in Hebrew.
Okay.
Nothing at all like that in Hebrew. There's one vowel that is like really short that is sometimes silent, but that is the most confusing part of Hebrew probably as far as this kind of stuff is concerned. Hebrew is a very simple language. It's just really weird. It's right to left. The verbs don't work the same way. Like it just, once you get used to the way it works though, it's really simple. Greek is very similar to English in a lot of ways, more so than Hebrew for sure. And Greek starts easier because it looks kind of like English, right? This is the Greek word for heart. You can kind of see how that's a K, how that's an A. You can kind of see how this might be a D. That looks sort of like an I, and that looks like an A again. This looks like a P, but it happens to be an R, so this is cardia. So that's pretty close to English, right? Like that's not nearly as bizarre as that.
I think that was the Kosa.
Capsula. That's what I thought it was.
Yeah.
Kapsla.
Yeah, I probably should have done a better job of making the delta look like a delta. My handwriting is terrible.
That does look like a cap,
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be that.
So cardia, like this, you can see how that looks like similar to English, and cardia, like cardiology is the study of the heart. So like you have stuff like that that's helpful. So this being the word for heart in Greek, it's not that hard to remember that. Word for heart in Hebrew is lev.
What?
You just have to memorize that. Like there's no English equivalent that is like, oh, that's similar to this. You just have to know.
How do you figure out the
All the squiggles, you just memorize them. Yeah. Aleph bet gimel dalet hey vav zayin chet tet yod kaf lamed mem nun samak ayin pei sadeh kaf resh shin shin tav. You
Okay,
just
you
memorize
spoke
it.
the alphabet, or is that all?
That's the Hebrew alphabet.
How long did it take for you to learn?
1 semester to learn the alphabet. It took me a year or so to where I could get to where I could read it. But again, like we were talking about yesterday, it's written over 1,000 years. You read Deuteronomy, it's fairly simple. You read Isaiah, it's a whole other thing, right? So like if I open to Isaiah, I'm going to need a lot of help. If I read Jonah, I can read Jonah. I can probably read all of Jonah without really any help at all. I can read Deuteronomy fairly well. I can read Genesis fairly well. Ruth, I could probably read without much help. But Isaiah,
How's it so much more difficult?
Psalms, time. Just like, where we were talking about with Beowulf, right? You learn, English now, but if you go back and read Old English, it's not the same thing.
Why does
Right.
it change so much?
Because we change the language, right? When I was growing up, you couldn't use the word literally to mean figuratively.
Or 8. That wasn't the
Right.
beginning of that.
Well, but even worse is literally, right? Like, when I was a kid, you couldn't say, that literally blew my mind. Well, no, it didn't literally blow your mind. Because your mind is still, a thing. And so, you can't say that.
I say that all the time.
But
I'm like,
now, if you look at,
literally.
right, if you look up literally in the dictionary, one of the definitions of literally is not literally. Right? One of the definitions is figuratively. Because
Right.
language changes based on how we use it.
Sorry, we're confusing.
That's funny.
No, that's just people, right? Everybody does that.
But the literally means literally, but we use it not literally.
Right.
So it's we use it the opposite way.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be used. So
Yeah.
It's great.
And that's why
Yeah.
English often is the hardest language to learn.
Yeah, English, Russian, and Chinese are the hardest from what I've heard. They're tough. And English is hard because there's just so many exceptions to everything, right?
Which
And
is
so,
weird to me because it's I grew up learning English, so it's trying to learn a different language like that. I'm okay, so there's a bunch of LIs in there.
Yeah.
Or weird
Yeah.
upside down L's and sevens things. That's what?
yeah, this is easier because it looks like English. Like the letters are similar to English. This is harder because it doesn't look like
It doesn't look like a letter.
anything, right? So it's really hard to get used to looking at it and having it seem like a language.
Reading,
Is that a
reading
question?
scribbles.
Yeah, he reads scribbles, guys.
Yeah.
But can you speak
No.
Hebrew?
No, I learned it to read, not to speak. So there's things that I have memorized, like there's things that I know that I can say in Hebrew, like Genesis 1:1 through Genesis 1:3. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, ve'haaretz hayata tohu vavohu, ve'ruach Elohim merchefet al panei hamayim, and yeah, can go on and on.
That's how you speak Hebrew.
That's Hebrew. That's Genesis 1:1
That sounds
and Genesis
so cool.
1:2. And then Deuteronomy 6:4. There's a liturgical song that I learned. That's Deuteronomy 6:4 is Heroes are Lord's God, God is one. And you take that line and then you add something else to it, and it's a part of Jewish liturgy. And it's Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed, which is Heroes are Lord's God, God is one. Blessed be His glorious name. His kingdom endures forever. So there's stuff like that I have memorized. And if I hear somebody speaking Hebrew, like I'll pick up a word here and there that I'm like, oh, you just said glory, or oh, you just said mountain, or whatever, but I can't understand what they're saying.
So you can't hold a conversation.
No. I can't think of how to say something, right? Because the way that I learned Hebrew was to learn it to read it, not to speak it, which is just a different skill set entirely.
Are you wanting to learn how to speak it?
I mean, it would be really cool, and I would love to, but like, in what time? So, I have a full-time job. I'm in a PhD program, and I'm a husband and a father. I don't have a lot of time to like learn how to speak Hebrew. So,
And you just find a playlist and it's like.
yeah.
Is,
I am an auditory learner, and so that kind of stuff helps.
That must be nice.
But it's you have to to learn a language. There has to be so much input, and you have to have so much practice with it that I don't have that. If I could go live in Israel for 6 months, I'm sure I could pick it up and it'd be awesome. But I stand a better chance of learning Spanish than learning Hebrew at this point, as far
I
as
stand a better
learning
chance
how
of
to.
keeping with English than any other language. Because I've been in Spanish
Yeah.
4 years going now. I couldn't ever tell you what anything
Yeah.
was besides the basics that everybody that can speak English
Yeah.
and the numbers 1 through 10. I could
Yeah.
do that.
I didn't take Spanish in high school. I took Latin, and I would get with the people that took Spanish, and we would teach each other how to cuss. And they would
Yeah.
teach me the bad words in Spanish, and I'd teach them the bad words in Latin.
Yeah.
So I only know bad stuff in Spanish, and then a few of the phrases that everybody knows, donde está la biblioteca,
I feel like people
stuff
literally
like
in
that.
those classes
Yeah.
should
Like
look up the
I'm
bad words
sorry.
just to know them.
I
Yeah.
don't know
Because
how
I
to
learned
speak
ASL in high
Spanish.
school, and we knew all the bad words in class.
Yeah.
And some of us would
Yeah.
accidentally do it in class,
Yeah.
and he would give us
Yeah.
a look. I'm like,
Yeah.
That's just
Anyway, so yeah, Hebrew, fun times, lots of fun. I really like it as a language, and I really enjoy it, but it is very weird, and it takes a while to get past the weirdness of it. That's honestly the hardest part of learning it is getting past looking at it and thinking it's just squiggles, and seeing it as a language and letting it be a language.
So I have a question that's on topic, off topic.
Oh wow,
Okay.
it's somewhat on topic.
As in it's about the Bible, but
Okay.
not about Hebrew.
Okay,
Okay.
I'll take it.
Well, sort of. But anyways.
Okay, I'll take it.
I'm sorry. So, why was it why did God choose the Israelites as the chosen people or whatever?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then, on top of that, does that make them more important or whatever because He chose them specifically?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So I don't think that it makes them more special. I think what God is doing is trying to, there has to be in His plan of redemptive history, there has to be a vessel of redemption, right? So He chooses Abraham, and through choosing Abraham, He chooses Abraham's descendants, right?
Well,
So,
why Abraham?
well, it seems like Abraham's the one that listened. It's entirely possible that I mean, remember when we pulled up the map of where Ur is and where Jerusalem is, and the 299 hours that it would take to walk that? It's entirely possible that he would have went to other people and said, "Go to the land that I would show you," and they said no.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's entirely possible that he went to 100 different people and they said no, and Abraham's the first person that said yes. Right? We don't know. What we know is that Scripture has a lot of good things to say about Abraham believing God. Right? That God comes to Abraham and Abraham believes God. So it seems like Abraham is unique in the fact that he is willing to hear God say crazy things and believe it.
So he's the crazy one.
Yeah. So God chooses him because he's the one who's actually going to hear that and believe it. And then in choosing him, he chooses Abraham's descendants. But he doesn't choose Abraham's descendants to exclude other people. Even in the explicit promise to Abraham, he's promising Abraham that all of the nations of the earth will be blessed through Abraham. So the intention is that through Abraham and through Israel, everyone would be blessed, and that Israel would be a light to the nations, that through Israel, through Abraham, God would bless everyone. Now, Israel messes that up, but God still blesses people. I mean, if you look at the Jonah story, right? Like, Jonah's a complete idiot, but God still uses Jonah to reach sailors and the Ninevites, right? And Jonah's a screaming moron, right? Like, he's
You're
just
not a fan of Johnny. You're like, screw him.
dude. He's an idiot. Like, he's an idiot. That story. So when I learned Hebrew, what we would do is we would like do our homework for the day, and then we would read Jonah. Like, if we had time left in class, we'd read Jonah in Hebrew because it's fairly easy to read in Hebrew. So I've read Jonah in Hebrew like maybe a couple hundred times. So I've read the book several times. It is shocking the things that he does in that book. It's crazy. In fact, the Devo tomorrow that we're going to use, Exodus 34, Jonah takes Exodus 34, which for context sake, the Devo that we did on Monday with the first years, Exodus 34 is after Israel has cheated on God, and God forgives them for their infidelity. Moses says, "Show me your glory," and God reveals himself, and in Exodus 34, 6 and 7, he basically describes his character and says, "I'm a God compassionate and slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness," right? When Jonah sees God forgive the Ninevites, he says at the beginning of chapter 4, "I knew that you were a God, compassionate and gracious and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness." And the way that he says that is so remarkably derisive and disrespectful that you would look at a God who literally forgives everyone, right? Like, all you have to do is repent and he'll forgive. That you would look at that God and say, "I knew you would do that. I knew it." Like, Jonah's an idiot. Jonah's, and I mean, I say that like I've been in his shoes. Like, I've looked at people and wanted God not to forgive those people, right? Like, I've been Jonah before, so it's convicting to me, but that doesn't get him off the hook. Like, he's an idiot, right? I just happen to be an idiot too. So, but yeah, Jonah's not a positive character. So, it's one of those things that frustrates me in kids ministry is that we're like, let's teach Jonah to the kids, and I'm like, actually, let's not. Like, unless we're going to teach it correctly, and if we're going to teach it correctly, we probably don't want to teach it to the kids, right? So, the story is not about the fish, right? The fish gets 2 verses, and that's it. The rest of the story is about Jonah being obstinate and stupid. So, anyway.
He's got some passionate answers about Jonah.
Jonah, yeah, I'll agree with him.
Yeah, Jonah's not a positive character. Not a positive character. If we had a little bit more time, we'd read it together, and I'm telling you, you want to, like, take half an hour, 45 minutes tonight and read Jonah by yourself, and then we talk about it tomorrow. And
I might just do that because you got some passion behind that.
Act 3, Scene 2. We're still in the same act here, still in the Old Testament. Still going to unpack some Old Testament stuff. The previous PowerPoint was just looking at the covenants, right? This one, we're going to be looking at specific stories in the Old Testament, specific characters in the Old Testament. And true to form, as we've done thus far, we're going to look at some Bible Project first, because they do a good job of summarizing things.
If you open a Protestant Christian Bible and look at the table of contents, you'll notice the first 3 quarters is a collection called the Old Testament. If you look at the list of books, you'll see it's made up of 39 smaller works that are grouped into 4 main sections. The first 5 are called the Pentateuch, followed by the historical books, then the poetic books, and finally the books of the prophets. Now that seems simple enough, but actually it's more complicated and way more interesting. This arrangement of the books in a single volume called the Old Testament is a later Christian tradition that developed after Jesus and the apostles. In ancient Jewish tradition, these works were all on separate scrolls and were conceived of as a unified 3-part collection called Tanakh. It's a Hebrew acronym for Torah, which means instruction, Nevi'im, which means prophets, and Ketuvim, which means writings. The Tanakh has the same books as the Protestant Old Testament, but they're arranged differently. The Torah corresponds to the Pentateuch, but the prophets consist of 4 historical narrative books and then the 15 works named after specific prophets. After this comes the writings, a diverse collection of poetic and narrative texts. Now this 3-part design is really, really old. It's referred to in ancient Jewish texts like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Wisdom of Ben Sira, even Jesus of Nazareth mentioned it. And that's because this 3-part shape is woven into the compositional design of the scrolls themselves. If you pay attention, you'll discover that every scroll has been coordinated by means of cross-references that link each work into the larger 3-part collection. So, who put all these scrolls together? It was a long process. Some of the famous contributors are named, like Moses or David, but most of the authors remain anonymous. In the Bible, they're simply called scribes or the prophets. These scrolls took shape throughout Israel's history as generations of prophetic scribes collected earlier stories and poems, integrated them into larger compositions, and then eventually shaped all this material into the unified library of scrolls, the Tanakh. It's clear from texts in the Psalms and Prophets that these prophetic scribes believed that God's Spirit was guiding this whole process, so that through these human words, God speaks to his people. That's why they treasured these texts, studying and composing them into a unified collection. We don't know when precisely this process was finished, but it was somewhere in the last centuries before the time of Jesus. In its final shape, the Tanakh offers a prophetic interpretation of Israel's history that claims to reveal God's purposes to rescue the whole world. And while we can't do justice to the whole collection in one video, it's helpful to get an overview of what these scrolls are all about. The Torah begins with God creating and blessing a great piece of real estate, our very good world. And God entrusts it to a creature that reflects the divine image, human, or in Hebrew, Adam. God appoints humanity to rule the world as kings and queens of creation. And the question is whether they will trust God's wisdom to discern good and evil, or seize autonomy and define good and evil for themselves. But there's another creature with the humans, a mysterious snake. It's in rebellion against the Creator, and it dupes the humans to foolishly rebel against God's generosity. As a result, humanity is separated from its divine source of life and exiled from a garden of blessing to die in a dangerous wilderness. From there, humanity keeps spreading and redefining good and evil, and things go downhill fast. They build cities plagued by violence and oppression, all leading to the foundation of a city called Babylon, where people exalt themselves to the place of God. And now the basic plot conflict of the whole Bible is set. God wants to bless his world and rule it through humans. But now, humans are the problem. They're under the influence of evil, they're stupid and short-sighted, and headed for self-destruction. And this is all a setup for God's solution. We need a new kind of human. And so God promises that a new human will come, who won't give in to the snake. In fact, he'll crush it and be crushed by it. From here, the story traces the promised lineage to a man and a woman, Abraham and Sarah. God entrusts them with the same divine blessing given to humanity on page 1. And so they leave Babylon to a new garden-like land that God promises to give his family. What follows is the story of Abraham's family. 3 generations, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, followed by 12 sons. And our hopes are high until we read their very dysfunctional and destructive family story. They lie, cheat, nearly kill each other, not to mention the sex scandals. But what did you expect after the garden story? They're humans. Eventually, Abraham's family ends up exiled down in Egypt. All these failures of Abraham's family form a dark background for the handful of bright moments in the story. God stays committed to these people. He even makes them an eternal promise called a covenant, that he will rescue and bless all humanity through them. How exactly isn't clear, but Abraham's family is at its best when they stop their selfish scheming and trust God's promise with radical faith. From here, the family grows. They end up enslaved in Egypt, and we're introduced to the Torah's other main character, Moses. God raises him up to rescue the Israelites and bring them to a mountain where they're all invited into a covenant relationship with God. They're given 613 terms of the relationship, guidelines for becoming new kinds of humans who will faithfully represent God to the world. And Moses brokers this whole deal because he's awesome. He's the ultimate prophet who speaks God's word to Israel. He's a priest who represents them before God, and he's even called a king, Israel's leader and deliverer in time of need. But as the Torah progresses, the Israelites fail big time. They violate the covenant, and even Moses rebels against God. In fact, the Torah ends with Moses predicting that Israel's failure will continue as they go back into the Promised Land, and they're going to end up in exile once again. But he has hope that God will fulfill his promise to rescue Israel. One day he will cover for their failures. He'll heal their selfish hearts so they can truly love God and live. And then Moses dies. Now, the final sentences of the Torah scroll are surprising. They zoom forward in time, and we hear from the prophetic scribes who shaped the Tanakh. They reflect back on the story of Moses from their vantage point, and they tell us that never again in Israel's history did a prophet like Moses arise. Man, I wish another prophet, priest, king like him would come along. And with that, we move into the Nevi'im. It has 2 sub-collections. First, the former prophets, 4 narrative works about Israel's story in the Promised Land, told from the later perspective of the prophets. Things start great with Joshua's leadership. We're told he's successful because he's just like Moses, and he meditates on Scripture day and night. But eventually, even Joshua fails, beginning Israel's long and violent descent into self-destruction, just like Moses and the garden story anticipated. These stories mostly focus on the failure of Israel's kings, prophets, and priests, how they lie, cheat, and kill each other, and worship idols. It's basically a longer, bloodier replay of the ancestors' failures. But there are some bright spots. God reaffirms his covenant promise to bless humanity through a new human. It will be a king from the line of David. And you get some stories about people like David or Solomon who have moments like Abraham when they trust God, but it never lasts. And wouldn't you know it, the family of Abraham ends up right where they began, conquered and exiled in Babylon. But remember, this whole story is being told from the later perspective of the prophets, and they know exile isn't the end. So they designed these stories of Israel's past as pointers to their future hope. When God does rescue his people out of Babylon, he'll send that new king who will be like Moses and David and Solomon were on their good days. In fact, this is what the second part of the Nevi'im, the latter prophets, is all about. There are 3 large and 12 short works connected to specific prophets. And this design intentionally recalls the 3 plus 12 ancestors from Genesis, whose stories of failure contained the seeds of future hope. These prophetic scrolls are loaded with cross-references that link back into the narrative of the Torah and the prophets, and they carry the story further. The job of Israel's prophets was to be like Moses, to accuse the old Israel of failure and corruption, and to warn them about the looming result, the great day of the Lord, which ended with defeat and exile in Babylon. But the prophets also promised that God had a purpose, to purify his people and recreate a new Israel who would be faithful like Abraham was. They'll live in a new covenant relationship with God under the reign of that promised ruler, who's described as a new Moses, but called by the name David. He will be the one to restore God's blessing to the entire world. The conclusion of the Nevi'im is just like the Torah. There's a note from the Tanakh's prophetic scribes. They reflect back over the whole story so far, and they urge readers to anticipate the arrival of a new Moses-like prophet who they call Elijah. He will announce the arrival of Israel's God to purify and save his people. From here we move into the Tanakh's third and final sub-collection, the Ketuvim, a diverse collection of scrolls. Each one has been designed to link back into the key themes from the Torah and the prophets and develop them further through an elaborate tapestry of cross-references. For example, the Psalms scroll is introduced by 2 poems that are coordinated to the beginning of the Torah and the prophets. In the first psalm, we meet the righteous one, who's described as a new Joshua, a successful leader who meditates on the scriptures. He's like the king promised by Moses, and he's like the eternal tree of life in the Garden of Eden. Psalm 2 then identifies this figure. It's the promised king, the Son of God from the line of David, who's going to defeat evil among the nations and restore God's blessing to the world. And the rest of the Psalms scroll teaches God's people how to pray as they wait for this future hope. Then there are the wisdom scrolls that address some of the most difficult questions raised by the story of the Torah and the prophets. So Proverbs sounds like Moses in the Torah. Trust in God, be faithful and obedient, and you'll have peace and success. But then Ecclesiastes and Job reflect back on Israel's complicated history and say, yeah, we tried that, and it's not that simple. These 3 books carry on a profound conversation about what it means to live wisely in God's good and often confusing world. 2 of the last books of the Tanakh to be written make a crucial contribution. The Daniel scroll looks back over the long history of Israel's failure and suffering as a strange door of hope into a new future for the world. One day, that new human promised in the Torah and prophets will arrive. He's going to be trampled by humanity's animal-like inclinations towards evil, but then God will vindicate him and raise him up to rule the world in divine power. And finally, the Scroll of Chronicles retells the entire story of the Tanakh, from the beginning up to Israel's return from exile. The author focuses on God's promise to David of a future king who will reunite God's people in a new Jerusalem and bring divine blessing to the nations. The final lines of the Chronicles scroll have been coordinated with key texts from all over the Tanakh. They keep alive the hope of an ultimate return from exile, pointing to the arrival of an Israelite whose God is with him, that he may go up and restore the new Jerusalem, and that's how the story ends. The Tanakh is a majestically and intentionally designed collection of ancient Hebrew scrolls. These diverse texts from all periods of Israel's history have been woven together as a unified story about God's covenant promise to Israel and to all humanity. They were made for a lifetime's worth of reading and reflection, as these remarkable human words offer a divine word of wisdom and future hope that still speaks today.
Questions or thoughts on that now?
I like
Is that okay?
That's
That's
good.
good.
Yeah, so the big picture then, and then we'll unpack this a little bit more tomorrow. But the big picture here is that Judaism, as we understand it, forms mostly in the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then Joshua and Judges to a certain extent. This is where we start to get what we know as Judaism kind of coalescing. Then, in the Davidic Reformation with David, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, and the Psalms, Judaism changes because prior to David, technically prior to Solomon, there's no temple. There's a tabernacle, right? So in formation, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, there's a tabernacle, there's no temple, right? So it's a different form of Judaism, right? The tabernacle is portable, the temple is not portable, right? And remember, what are the 3 things promised to Abraham that we need to keep in mind in the Old Testament? Land, king, people, right? When we have a tabernacle, we can be portable, we can move around because we don't have a land yet, right? We can wander and we can set up somewhere else, right? But once we have the land, we want to build a temple, right? Because we don't need to wander anymore, right? So we have a shift with David. And then, remember, after David, after Solomon, the kingdom split, right? So we have Israel and we have Judah, right? So we have two different kingdoms. Well, those kingdoms get pulled off into exile. When they get pulled off into exile, exile means your people are taken from the land and put somewhere else, right? So land, nation, and Messiah in exile, how much of that goes away? Do they have the land anymore if they're in exile? No. Do they have the people anymore if they're in exile?
So.
Sort of, but not really. And do they have a Messiah if they're in exile? No. Right? So these three things that they're really focused on are gone when they're in exile. And so the prophetic Reformation and the Babylonian Reformation, prophetic Reformation is prior to the exile. What prompts the exile is the Israelites become idolatrous. They walk away from Yahweh. And so what the prophets do in trying to bring Judaism back to what it ought to be is they're calling Israel into obedience for the Torah, right? Like, here's what we've agreed to. Here's what the covenant is supposed to be. Come back to what it is supposed to be. Leave all of the things that you're doing. If you don't, you're going into exile. That's the prophetic Reformation. So most of the prophets are either saying that's going to happen or here's why that happened, right? So like, this is a bad thing. We don't want it to happen, right? And then in the Babylonian Reformation, when the exile occurs, they have to rethink what Judaism means without a temple. There's no tabernacle anymore. There's no temple anymore. What does it even mean to be Jewish at this point? There's one passage in the Psalms that is particularly relevant to this. This is one of those places in the Bible that you probably never hear preached. But Psalm 137 is a lament psalm, and it's, by the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept, and our captors asked for us a song. Now imagine what it would feel like to have been taken from your land forcefully, put into a foreign land, made to work for those foreign people. And then those foreign people say, hey, why don't you sing for us? How are you going to feel in that situation? Not good, right? And so in Psalm 137, it says, how can we sing the songs of Zion when we're in a foreign land? How can we even do that? And it closes, Psalm 137:9 is, blessed are those who take your babies and bash their heads against the rock. Because that's how they feel about their captors, right? These captors that are like, hey, come on, sing for us. Cheer up, sing for us in captivity, in a foreign land. Sing for us, right? The Israelites in response to that are like, I'd really love it if somebody murdered your babies. That's how I feel right now. I really would like it if somebody murdered your babies. Now, we have to contend with the fact that is actual legitimate worship music, right? You're not going to hear that from Hillsong anytime soon, right? That's in the Psalms, though, right? Like, there is room in the Psalms to express how you feel when things like this happen, right? When you experience and this is particularly difficult as Pentecostals, because we like to be like, yay, celebratory, everything's going to be great, right? But in the Psalms, we have legitimate expressions of, like, I hate life right now. I hate everything right now. And I want everyone to just go away. That is a legitimate expression of worship within the Psalms. Now, we shouldn't stay there, right? We shouldn't live there. But if you're there, there is room for you to express that within worship, right? So Psalm 137 is in this Babylonian Reformation where the Jews are having to rethink, what does it even mean to be Jew? We don't have the land, we don't have the people, we don't have the Messiah. What even are we? What are we even going to do? Right? And so all of this stuff coming out of the Babylonian Reformation, this is 586 BC. This is within 400 years of David ruling. So this is not super far from David's rule, right? This is closer to David than it is to Jesus. This is setting the stage for when we get to Jesus, that idea that I was talking about of that like frustration with Rome, that like, I really just want us to rule ourselves, right? I really just want you to leave us alone and let us handle things on our own, right? That feeling, that's what's kind of percolating here, okay? So with that, we'll break for the rest of the day, and we'll pick up with this tomorrow, okay?